All right, folks, go ahead and grab a seat if you would. Hey, the next couple of weeks, we're going to take a little mini break out of our messages out of 1 Corinthians. And today I want to talk to you about something that really I began thinking about preaching this in the last couple of weeks as I heard a couple of things. One, many of you in this last week might have heard about the much publicized Pew Research company's data on the religious profile of the U.S. Any of you guys see that this week? A lot of talk about that. Any of you guys readers here? And so a lot of talk about the religious makeup of America, and there's been many news stories talking about, is Christianity in great decline in America, and there's a lot of that was actually kind of overblown. And if you kind of dig into the research a little more fully, what you'll see is a reasonable amount of what we're seeing is actually a pretty good thing. And that what is happening is for the whole history of our country, there was kind of a cultural expectation, whether you were a practicing Christian or a non-practicing Christian, to self-identify as a Christian for kind of cultural expectations. And so what we're seeing now is as many of those cultural expectations are being removed, people who previously would have just were non-practicing Christians would have self-identified as Christians, and now they're just being more honest and just saying, no, I'm none of the above. And so in many ways, the data has been kind of overhyped. But one thing that is certainly true is that the church is being very ineffective in our ability to reach and to retain millennials, people born in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so there is this great concern about churches in general and LifeChurch in specific being effective at taking the good news of Jesus to all people everywhere. And then I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where I heard a quote by a guy named Leith Anderson, who is the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. He's a scholar, a church growth expert, a pastor. And he said this. He said that at most churches, once they turn 9 years old, see a significant drop-off at their effectiveness in reaching unchurched people. And that kind of stuck with me simply because LifeChurch is 9 years old right now. And so I was like, wow, we cannot let that happen to us. And so every couple of years, I've taken us back to a passage of scripture in the Gospel of Luke. So if you have your Bibles, look at Luke 15. Yeah! I like the little whistle there. That's kind of nice. That's nice. You guys are customizing your Bible shout-outs. And I guess, wow. All right, Luke chapter 15. Let's just start in verse 1. It says, now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to hear Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled. So the Pharisees, religious leaders, and the scribes, religious leaders, they grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So what we see here is this, is I think directly tied to why many churches, after they reach a certain age, become less effective evangelistically, is the reality is many times as people become more religious, they begin to have less of a passion for people that are far from God. That's what we're seeing here with these religious people. The Pharisees were the religious leaders, the scribes were the religious leaders, and they see Jesus spending time with people that are far from God, people who were known to be living in sinful lifestyles, and they're saying, Jesus, why are you with them? And so what Jesus is about to do is he's going to tell them 3 stories with the same message. The thing is, if Jesus says something one time, it matters. If Jesus says something 2 times, he's saying, hey, I really want you to get this. It really matters. If Jesus says to us 3 times, he's saying, listen, I really want you to get this, and I know you're not very smart. And I'm not a very smart man, but I do know what love is, Jenny. And so Jesus is saying, hey, I really want you to get this. I'm going to say it to you 3 different times, 3 different ways. And he tells these stories. And what Jesus ultimately is doing is he's spelling out, hey, people that are far from God, they matter a great deal to God. And so he tells these 3 stories. And so here's what I want you to get this morning. When we act like lost people that are far from God, when we act like they don't matter, one thing we're doing is we do this when we forget how much they matter to God. And so Jesus in this passage in three different ways, he tells us how much lost people matter. One is because he's spending time with them. See, one thing that happens, and there's good in this and there's a lot of bad in this, is that the longer someone is a follower of Jesus, the more and more their circle of friends becomes other followers of Jesus. And there's a lot of good in that. We are called to have relationships with other followers of Jesus and to love one another well. Jesus said it as we love one another inside the family of God. That's how the whole world will know that we're followers of Jesus. It really matters. The Bible tells us that we're to love one another and to serve one another and to encourage one another and to be hospitable to one another, to confess our sin. There's all these one another's that are relationships inside the church. They really, really matter. That's why we do things like life groups. We believe it's in these relationships that many times we get to live out the Christian life and the way we're meant to. And so that really matters. But unfortunately, the downside to that is consequently the data says the longer someone is a follower of Jesus, the fewer and fewer real relationships they have with people in a meaningful way outside the church. And so, but what we see the example of Jesus is Jesus had these close relationships with his disciples, but then he was always around people that were far from God because he knew that they mattered to the heart of God. It's one of the greatest challenges of being a pastor is kind of I'm surrounded by Christians all the time, and I tried to lead Pastor Tom to Christ this last week, but he told me he was all good, and so pray for Rob though. And so, but it's a challenge. And so that's something I wrestle with is how can I be more proactive to spend time with people that are far from God? But Jesus did it. It's his way of saying people that are far from God matter to God. And then Jesus is going to tell these three stories that all have the same point. He says there was a shepherd who had 100 sheep, and then one of the sheep got lost. The shepherd left the 99 and went and found the one, brought it back to the flock, and then he throws a giant party. And then Jesus said, that's what happens in heaven every time someone who's far from God comes in a right relationship with God. And then Jesus tells another story. He says, there's a woman, and she had 10 coins, and she lost one. Have any of you guys ever lost money in your house? Have you ever done that? And you kind of just start looking everywhere. You're pulling up couch cushions. You're finding unidentified objects under there. You're like, what is that? And it's like a 5-year-old peanut under there. And so this woman, she's got 10 coins, she loses one. And it says she searches her whole house. And then she finds the one coin. And then she rejoices, she throws a big party. And then Jesus said, that's what happens in heaven every time someone who's far from God comes into right relationship with God. And then he tells a story, there was a father who had 2 sons. And one of the sons came to the dad and said, Dad, I'd like to get my inheritance early. Did you guys even know that was a possibility? I'm like, is that a thing? And so he gets the inheritance early, and then he goes off and he squanders it. And he finds himself homeless. He ends up kind of taking care of some pigs. He's living in this pig pen. And then he realizes, he says, man, my dad's servants live better than this. I'm going to go back to my dad and confess everything I've done wrong and ask him if I can just be one of his servants. And he comes back, and the dad sees him in the distance and runs to him. And then he throws a big party. And then Jesus said, that's how it is in heaven whenever someone who's far from God comes into right relationship with God. And so what Jesus is saying is he's saying, hey, I want you to get this. People far from God matter an awful lot to God. What's cool about these stories is each story builds on intensity of the one before. It goes 1 out of 100. You lose one thing out of 100, you're bummed that you lost it, but you still have 99 left. Then he goes to 1 out of 10. He ups the stakes. It goes from 1% to 10%. And then it goes to 1 out of 2. So now we're at 50%. So he's upping the intensity. He's saying lost people matter to God. Lost people really matter to God. Lost people really, really matter to God. And then each metaphor is more meaningful than the one before. The one sheep is symbolic of our jobs, and the reality is, our jobs matter. But any of us that are living any kind of balanced life would say that our jobs are not the most important thing in our life. The real reason that we have our jobs for many times is so we can have money. So Jesus goes from job, but he knows really most of us, money is really what the job's about. But then Jesus knows that most of us, the reason we want money is so we can take care of our family. So it goes, the sheep represents job, the coin is money, and then he goes, hey, and this one guy, he had a son. He had 2 sons and he lost one. So Jesus is once again saying lost people really matter to God. Lost people really, really matter to God. He wants us to get this. And so Jesus we forget how much they matter to God, but Jesus spends time with them. He declares them valuable and talks about how God rejoices when they're found. But I want to really kind of focus in on the last part of this third story. Because what happens is there's another character introduced into that story of the prodigal son. The one son goes away and he comes back, but then there's this older brother. And the older brother symbolizes these religious people at the beginning of the story. These religious people who went to Jesus and said, why are you spending time with these people that are far from God? And then at this end of this third story, Jesus says, here's what you're acting like. So if you have your Bibles, go over to verse 25. We act like lost people don't matter when we show anger, when we should show love. Let me show you this. Here it is. I'm going to skip up to verse 21. He says, and the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. Skip down to verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. There was a big party going on. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. See, we act like lost people don't matter to God when we get angry, when we should show love. See, really what makes sense in any kind of idea, this brother's been gone for a long time. There was question marks as to what had happened to him, question marks if they'd ever see him again, question marks if he was alive or dead, and now he's back. And really the only thing that makes any kind of sense, if you hear that your brother who's been gone for this long time, you didn't know what happened, didn't know if you'd ever see him again, but he's inside and there's this big party. The only thing that makes sense at all is just to run in that party as fast as you can and give him the biggest bear hug imaginable and say, brother, I'm so glad you're okay. I'm so glad you're home. But the older brother doesn't do that. He gets mad. He gets angry. And unfortunately, it seems that Christians today are best known for what we're maddest about. Does it ever seem that way to you? I can't figure out if there's just a bunch of angry Christians or if the media just does their best job to find the stupidest, most angry Christian they can find to put on TV. Do you guys have a gut on that? I don't know. And my daughter, I was eating some pizza with my daughter on Friday. There's really fewer things that are better to do with your daughter than go to Bully's and eat some pizza. And so, and she says, Dad, the weirdest thing happened today at school. She goes here to Demonte Ranch High School. And she said there were these people who were protesting outside of our school today. Did you guys hear about that? Anyone? You guys talk to your kids? And so it's a conversation. Give it a try. And so, how was your day today? And she says, and I said, well, and she said that they were talking all this Jesus stuff and yelling all this mad stuff and about people going into lakes of fire and lots of stuff. And she just said it was so weird and people didn't know what to think and everyone's just kind of staring at them and they were just so mad. And this one guy shook this kid and the school police came and said, you can't touch the kids. And the thing of it is, I have the ability as an adult to recognize that there's something like 1.5 billion people on the planet that claim to be Christians. And out of any number that large, there's a percentage of crazies, right? You guys get that? Jesus said, wherever there's 2 or 3 gathered, I'm there. And I believe wherever there's 100 gathered, there's one crazy. And so, not as quotable as the Jesus quote, but I still sticking with it. And so it's just been my experience. But can you imagine being a 15-year-old kid who maybe doesn't have a church background, maybe never been to church in your life, and your first exposure to people who claim to be Christians or people holding signs and yelling at you? You just think, man, I bet Christians are just angry. I didn't think it was funny, but and then so we act like lost people don't matter when we show anger, when we should show love. Look here at verse 29. We act like lost people don't matter when we think that we're better than they are. Look here at verse 29. He said, but he answered his father and he said, look, these many years I have served you and I never disobeyed your command. Let me ask you a question. How many of you guys have kids? Yes? You should talk to them. And so, but how many of you have had kids that have never disobeyed you? It's not been my experience either. My kids, within 30 minutes of being born, they started disobeying us. Stop crying. They just kept crying, And so, but this son, he says to his dad, he says, look, man, all these years I've never disobeyed you. What he's doing is he's overestimating his own goodness, which is called being self-righteous. When we kind of elevate our level of goodness and it's amazing how Christians, we kind of have this amnesia, of anything that we've ever done that was really stupid and wrong. Whether it's stuff that we did before we came to know Christ that was just wrong, or it's stuff we've done since we've known Christ. We kind of all have this ability to kind of forget that stuff, but many times focusing on the faults of others, which is what it is to be self-righteous, to kind of elevate your own sense of being right outside of what Christ has done for you, but just kind of in your own self. And so that's what he's doing. He's kind of overestimating his own goodness. He's saying, I've never disobeyed you, Dad. And it's just not even true at all. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul, he lists a bunch of sins, a bunch of high-profile sins, adultery and stuff like that. And then he reminds them and he says, and such were some of you. But God's forgiven you and he's changed you and he's changing you. But the reality is this older brother has lost sight of the fact that he's a sinner too. We act like lost people don't matter when we're selfish. Look here at verse 29. He answered his father. He said, look, these many years I've served you and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. Any of you guys with multiple kids ever kind of feel this pressure for everything to be equal, right? You ever feel some of that? And so the kid won't be like, well, gosh, you took them to Chuck E. Cheese for their birthday, but I'm just here at the house eating your mac and cheese. What's the deal? And ever feel like you got a little bit of that? And so that's this older brother. He's like, what he's doing is he's making it all about him. He's like, Dad, I never get a party. You never killed a goat for me. You never done, what's this? I never get the good stuff. And what he's doing is he's just making it all about him. There's something that happens many times to people that have been in church a long time is they kind of begin to think it is about them. And they kind of begin, especially even when it comes to church stuff, is they kind of think it's primarily about me and what I can get out of it. And as long as my needs are being met 100%, then I'm good. But the second that I'm so much not, and there's somewhere else that can meet them better, and to kind of make it all about me, this kind of consumeristic mindset, which is totally crazy. And the reality is it's just not about any one of us. The next time you have a thought about church that begins with, I don't like that. I don't like how they do this. I don't like how we don't have any chocolate covered donuts. I don't, just remind yourself that that's just really doesn't matter. It's not really about any one of us. If you think that there's not things about LifeChurch I don't like, I'm here to let you know there's a lot of things about LifeChurch I don't like. And I started it. But at the end of the day, it's not primarily about what I like about a certain thing. It's not primarily about what you like about a certain thing. It's primarily about the mission that God's given us. Jesus had a mission to seek and to save the lost, and he's invited us to join him in that. And so the thing of it is when we make it about us, we begin focusing on our preferences or our conveniences, and it's really just it takes us away from the mission. Those things are really not the most important at all. And it can be little things. You know, some of you may not like the style of music we've got. Most of you do, because you're Christians, but some of you, some of you may not. Some of you told me, I think it's just too loud. Hey, listen, there's times I think it's a little loud, and I'll go and have a little chat with our sound guys. Sometimes then they'll explain to me, hey, you know what? There's challenges coming into a theater like this that is made for non-amplified sound. And so we bring amplified sound in here, and so there's challenges, and we're doing the best we can, and you know, and then I berate them until they cry. And so, and I just thank them for their faith. The reality is, what? What happened? I like that. That's good. We rigged that. And so, Jeremy. All right, so that's funny. Not really. So here it is. But the reality is it's not about any one of us. When it comes to music at LifeChurch, we're going to do music that we believe honors God and points to Him. But we're going to do it in the way that we believe is going to connect with the most number of people that may not yet know Jesus. And so you're probably not going to come in and us have a string quartet down here. We're not going to install a pipe organ here in the theater. The school wouldn't be into that. And so yeah, we act like lost people don't matter when we get selfish. We act like lost people don't matter when we forget what God has done for us. Look at verse 30. He says, but when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. And so the son's saying, man, Dad, you gave him all that money. Now you're having this party for him. What have you ever done for me? And then he says, son, you've always been with me, and all that I have is yours. And he meant that both figuratively and literally, that he was the older son. He was going to get the larger portion of the inheritance. But really what he's done is he's just forgotten the evidence of the Father's goodness in his own life. And what happens many times is people that have maybe walked with Jesus for a while is it's easy to forget what God has done for us and what He's delivered us from and the goodness of God shown into our life. And when we forget that, what can happen is it affects the way in which we look at people that are far from God. See, the thing is, when I walk with this awareness of the goodness of God in my own life, then there's this desire that will come to me where I desire for God to do that in others. Here's the last thing and we're done. Look at verse 32. When I act like lost people don't matter, what I've done is I've forgotten what's at stake. Let me show you this, verse 32. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So what Jesus is saying to these religious people, he's saying, hey, you're like this older brother who has he's lost sight of what's really at stake. And what he's saying is, he said, this older brother, the younger son's back, and there's this big party, and he's just mad, like, where's my party? And why don't I get anything? And the dad says, hey, son, you don't get it. He says, I thought your brother was dead. I didn't know if I was going to ever see him again. I didn't know what had happened to him, and I thought he was dead, but he's not. He's alive. He's saying, you don't understand what's at stake. This is life or death. And I think what happens when we think about people that are far from God is it's easy to kind of lose sight of what's at stake. And really what we're talking about is we're talking about life or death stuff, heaven or hell stuff. And sometimes I think it's easy. Sometimes I find myself just kind of getting caught up in the busyness of my own life and running from meeting to meeting. And sometimes I try to kind of just slow myself down and kind of just stare at the person in front of me. Not like in a weird stalker way, but like 90% of that, like almost, Like maybe they think I'm a weird stalker, but benefit of the doubt, I'm not. And so you kind of look at somebody and just think to yourself, that is a person with a soul that Jesus died for. And they're going to spend forever somewhere. And if you think about that, at that point, the coffee they're getting for you really becomes not very important. If you look at that coworker that way, or you look at that dad on your kid's soccer team that way, and just remember that this is a person with a soul, and Jesus died for them, and they're gonna spend forever somewhere. The stakes are high. And so what Jesus is saying to these religious people, he's saying, you're like that older brother, and all you can see is yourself, and all you can see is kind of your convenience or your preferences or what's happening to you, but there's a whole lot more going on. This is a high stakes deal. This is life or death. This is heaven or hell. This is big, big stuff. Final point. The measure of how much lost people matters to us is shown by what I am or am not willing to give up in order to reach them. We know how much lost people matter to us by what I am or am not willing to give up in order to reach them. And so that could be like giving up. You know, we're going to be in the fall. We're going to probably begin to set aside some parking spots that'll be for new people. And so by you giving up your close parking spot, you're making a spot for someone that can come and maybe hear the good news of Jesus for the first time. Are you willing to give that up, or are you going to park in the visitor parking, because we will have you towed? And so, don't test us there. And so, man, if we sung songs every week that were too loud for you and not your style, but you knew that your grandson who doesn't know Jesus really digs it and he'll come for that, would you give that up? Are you willing to give up your financial resources generously so the mission can go forward? You're willing to give up your comfort and convenience to turn to that coworker and say, hey, man, I'd love to talk to you about what God's done in my life, or even just bring you to my church sometime. Kind of give up that kind of comfort you got there. You're willing to give that up. Because what we see in Jesus in Romans 5:8 is that the measure of how much we care is by how much we'll give up. Let me show this to you. It says, but God shows, it's the measure, it's the demonstration, it's the evidence, his love for us, the amount he cares, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, how much do lost people matter to God? How much do lost people matter to Jesus? So much that he gave up everything. He went to the cross. Two final thoughts. One is, if you're here and you're already a follower of Jesus, I want you to understand this. Let me tell you something that my wife explained to me early in our marriage. One of many, many things. She said this. One time Claire was talking about something that it wasn't my bag. I think she might have been talking about scrapbooking or something like that. And I'm like, hey, let's watch a little Sports Center and scrapbooking, schmapbooking, you know. And so, and then she said this. She said, hey, when you care about what I care about, it helps me to know that you care about me. So since then, I've joined a bunch of scrapbooking clubs, and so, but the reality is, the evidence of loving somebody and evidence of loving somebody is we begin to care about what they care about. And so if we say we love and follow Jesus, and Jesus says, I care about lost people. I really care about lost people. I really, really care about lost people. Then we should too. And maybe you're here and you say, you know what, I might be one of those. I might be one of those people that's far from God. I might be kind of like that lost sheep, or like that lost coin, or like that lost son. I don't know if I've begun a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't know that I've made the choice to follow Jesus. I want you to know that you do matter to God. And that because you matter to God, you matter a whole lot to a lot of people here. And that you matter so much to God that Jesus died in your place, took the punishment for your sin, punishment for my sin. He rose from the dead because you matter to him. And he wants to have a relationship with you. And all he wants you to do is just to cry out to him and to say, God, I want you. And I want you to have me. I believe that Jesus died on the cross. I believe he rose from the dead. And I believe he's my only hope. You can do that in the comfort of your chair here in a moment. There'll be people that would love to talk to you about that afterwards if you want to down front. Let's pray. So God, we do love you. And so God, I pray that you would help us to love you more so that we might care more about the things you care about. And God, specifically about people that are far from you. So God, I pray you help us to know that they really, really matter to you and that they'd really matter to us. That they'd matter enough for us to do something so that we can point them towards you. In Jesus' name.
Now I'm made new because of you. Yeah, you hold my hand. You remind me who I am. You hold my hand. I'm alive in you again. I'm made new. You're making me stronger. You're healing my heart. With your hands you hold me in. You set me